I'm John Wilker, the organizer of 360 IDEP. I hope you enjoy this session recording, but first I wanted to mention one thing. We've served the community since 2009, and over the past few years we've had to take on debt in an effort to keep the conference alive. After several unforeseen challenges, not the least of which is a pandemic of indefinite duration, we've had to make the hard choice to end the conference as we're now facing over $100,000 in debt. As a result of requests from the community of how they can help, we've created a GoFundMe campaign. If you're inclined and able, please consider donating to help keep 360 IDEF going. The QR code after this will link you to the campaign. Thank you. Enjoy the recording.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. Well, hello everyone. My name is Francisco Cantu, but everyone calls me Frank. And I am here today, all the way from Mexico, to talk to you about app review horror stories. And by the way, if for some reason I start mumbling or you just don't understand me, feel free to raise your hand and I will be more than happy to clarify what I just said. Anyway, what are these so-called app review horror stories? Well, I guess all of you may have encountered one at some point when you're dealing with Apple. It's when you bump into something, not necessarily because you're doing something wrong during the whole review. It's because Apple maybe just decided to go all Texas Chainsaw Massacre on you for some stupid little reason. And I am not here, despite the title, I am not here to hate on Apple. I am not an Apple hater. In fact, I am an Apple fanboy. After this whole session, you can come to me and I will be more than happy to show you my official fanboy ID. And so the whole purpose of this session actually was a lot longer, but I had to cut a lot of stories. I had to cut a lot of parts to actually make the whole 45-minute session possible. So without further ado, here we go. Basically, I had to divide everything into just 2 sections instead of 5. First, we have, of course, the stories. And at the end, we're going to have everything, all the lessons to survive the App Store horror that we may face. Like I said, in this particular talk, I am not going to hate on Apple. And Apple, if for some reason you're watching this, please don't ban my developer account, even if we're having a bit of fun at your expense. I am not going to talk about common app rejections, you know, the ones where like there's some missing metadata or things like that. And I am not going to talk about lethal app rejections. What I call lethal app rejections are the ones where there's no hope for actually getting the app approved. We're talking about like forbidden categories like emulators, or maybe just scam apps that Apple even has the right to terminate your own developer account. I am not an Apple employee. I have no insider knowledge, so everything you will hear today is purely from my own personal experience as someone who has been sending apps to the App Store for over 10 years. And obviously, all the lessons that we're going to talk here today are not going to be for everyone. They're going to be for very specific cases when you have to deal with the App Store horror. And I think I should put this in front of everyone before we start with the session. You will immediately recognize it. If you run to the press and trash us, it never helps. This, in case you didn't know, this was actually in the App Store review guidelines sometime around 2010. And when it was first published, it was a very kind weird of tone. I mean, us as developers, we have a special relationship with Apple, and by relationship, that means that everything goes both ways. This told us a lot about what Apple thought that kind of relationship should be with us. Anyway, to their credit, they removed that pretty quickly, but the internet never forgets, obviously. Enough talk. Here come the famous horror stories. All of the horror stories that I am going to talk about today are ones that I've personally experienced. They're not just only from personal apps that I've published in the App Store, they're also for apps that I had the fortune to work with, many amazing, talented teams. Because of that, I am not going to name any of the apps. I am not even going to say what kind of apps they were, unless it's relevant to the whole story. But if you go and dig around my social media, you should be able to connect the dots, which kind of apps I was talking about. So, horror story number one. That time I tried to follow UI trends. This is actually the oldest story that I have for you today. If I had to guess, this was probably around 2011. And it all starts with one tweet from yours truly. And you can tell that this is an old tweet because my personal pic there shows you myself with a head full of hair. So yeah, it's that old. But yeah, let's take a look. You can see here that I am complaining because Apple actually rejected an app because I broke some of the human interface guidelines, but gave no real specifics. Literally, what they sent me just said, rejected because you're breaking the human interface guidelines. So you can see lots of emotions there. Disbelief, confusion, and finally, determination. And that's how we come to the first lesson today. Seek clarification. It's no secret that when you're talking with app review, they will be very vague. Most of the times they will just show you the guideline that you're breaking without giving any real specifics as to how. It's very frustrating, to say the least. And everyone guesses that it's in their best interest to be vague. It's in their best interest to remain vague so that the rules can be interpreted in their favor. So it is our job as developers when dealing with Apple to make sure that we get all the information we need in order to continue doing our jobs. It is our job to seek clarification, no matter how many replies we need to send to Apple. And sometimes, unfortunately, it will take a lot of replies to get the answer that we need. Anyway, back to the story. Once I sought clarification from Apple, they told me that the app was manipulating the status bar. Back then, that was a big no-no. Basically, what the app was doing was showing loading messages being overlaid on the status bar. You may recall that this was invented by an app called Reader, an RSS reader around that time. And a lot of apps started doing it because it was definitely something that the users liked. So when I did this, I honestly did not expect it to be a problem. So why is Apple taking an issue with the app I am working on, and all of these other apps in the App Store are allowed to do that? So of course, I thought maybe it was a mistake, and I sent my first appeal ever to the app review board. And that's when I come to my next lesson. App review is not fair. That's the only way we can put it. And it's something that we've seen time and time again in all of these years in the App Store. And the sooner we make peace with this fact, the happier we will be. So, going back to my app, I never received a written reply from Apple. In fact, what I got was a telephone call. I got a call from some area code in California, and there was this very kind Apple rep on the other side of the line, and he basically told me, oh, we cannot allow the app to go onto the App Store as it currently is. We cannot comment about other apps in the App Store. But if you remove that, we will be more than happy to approve it immediately. And that was basically the end of the conversation. No time for a rebuttal or anything. So, of course, I was left with two options. You can probably guess which option I took at the time. I removed the whole status bar UI, and to their credit, the app was approved very, very quickly. Back in those times, it was weeks and weeks of waiting for the app to be reviewed and approved. And one of the biggest takeaways from this is that basically, sometimes there's just things that's out of your reach and you have to accept it, unfortunately. And finally, one of the things that I must admit to you, spoiler alert, is that in this whole session, this is the only story where Apple is triumphant. On the other stories that I am going to tell to you today, I was triumphant. So spoiler alert. The next horror story is simply called, "That Time I Swore We Offered No Account Signups." You can probably more or less where all of this is going. So this is also an old story, but it is still very interesting. This is actually for a VOD app that I worked on. And back then, the VOD landscape was very different. For example, back then, instead of paying for lots of streaming services, I just paid for Netflix. Today, my bill looks more like a cable bill than something I would get from the internet. And I partly blame Apple for that. They just make it so easy to get all of these VOD services just because they have in-app purchases and I don't have to provide all of those companies my credit card. But anyway, what about the horror story? Well, we tried our best to be a fully compliant VOD app, and we weren't expecting any trouble. We had signups using in-app purchases and everything. The only real difference that the app had at the time was that instead of showing a bunch of onboarding screens, we actually decided to put a small link inside the app that allowed the user to optionally tap on it and be taken to an external web page that was isolated, one where they could not navigate away from, and it gave them all of the features that the app had. That's it, that was the only difference. It was never our intention to drive subscriptions from outside the app and bypassing in-app purchases. And you can probably tell where this story is going. We received our first message from Apple that says, "You should not link outside the app." And that's it. There's like no clarity on what exactly it is they're talking about. It's so vague that I even started questioning other possibilities beyond the onboarding page that we were linking out to. Were they also having issues that we had, like our support link inside the app? A combination of anything? Did they want us to maybe just have a pure onboarding experience inside the app, never linking users outside? So of course we have the reminder that we need to seek clarification from Apple, because unfortunately, most of the times they will be vague. So the conversation with App Review went something like this. For starters, I should say that they were very kind in the entire ordeal. To this date, I have never had more kind people reply to us than in this particular story. And it's something that actually made a difference in the end, just knowing that at least they can sympathize with what we're going through. And I still cannot believe that this, being the second oldest story, is the only one I've encountered in my career where the people behind can sympathize. Anyway, the horror starts, besides seeking clarification, all of this whole process took longer than it should have. They continued being very vague. When we asked for clarification, they said, yeah, you cannot link to the account management page. And we had no account management page that we were linking to. They started sending screenshots. And those screenshots were the ones that we were using for showing the features, the ones that the user couldn't navigate away from. And they actually sent the same screenshot several times, each time we asked for clarification. Those times, they didn't even highlight what was offending about the screenshot or anything. But a very observant team member actually noticed that at the very bottom of the screenshots that they started sending, there was a very, very small and hard to miss link that took users to the account management page. This obviously was a bug. It was never our intention to include this. And obviously, the evidence was that it was just so poorly positioned. It was almost dark text on a dark background, so hard to miss. Nobody expected that. So once we found this, we assumed, okay, maybe this is what Apple is talking about. So we went ahead and fixed the bug on the website. We removed it entirely. And we replied to Apple, okay, we've removed this link on the website. Is this what you were referring to? Is it okay now? And wouldn't you believe it? We never received a reply, but the app just got magically approved after that. So obviously, this was partly our fault. It was a bug caused by our own team. But what made this such a horrendous ordeal for everyone involved was that there just wasn't clarification. It doesn't matter how kind the reviewers were. I mean, it certainly helped, but it took way longer than it should have. It would have been so easy for them to highlight the link that everyone was missing in this particular case. So, on to the next story. This is the story that I call, that time I thought an app was stuck in some kind of review loop. And this is ones that still keep me up at night, maybe because I could have actually done better for this. So let's give some background about this particular app. It was a very well-established app in the App Store. It had been there for several years already. It complied with all of the in-app purchase requirements when it comes to subscriptions. And it had a good history with Apple, no bad rejections or anything like that. It had probably around 100,000 monthly active users, and it was very well regarded by both the users and the media alike. But yeah, spoiler alert, this also has to do with in-app purchases when the whole nightmare starts. We submit an app like any other to Apple. There was nothing even special in the update. And it was mostly stuff that the user never sees. We didn't even change like the in-app purchase flow or anything like that. So of course, the first reply that we get from Apple is, excuse me. The first reply that we get from Apple is, how does a user purchase a subscription? Obviously, we were shocked. The app had been there for years now, and this is the first time that we get this kind of question from Apple. I think that the in-app purchase flow was very good, honestly. We never received complaints from users. Nobody called us frauds or anything. So why was Apple asking about this in the first place? Well, it doesn't matter. Maybe there's some kind of new review procedure that they're just following, and they're asking for the proper instructions. So I actually wrote down the instructions for Apple and sent them their way. And I thought that was going to be it. I thought that that was the end of the story, now that they were going to have the instructions. But oh no, 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 no. There's a whole cycle of frustration here that went on with Apple. First, it was that clarification with subscriptions. Then they asked us something totally different where they requested clarification, and of course we answered. But then the third time, it was again the exact same question. How does a user purchase a subscription? Literally, 2 questions ago, we already answered that. No big deal. I thought maybe it was a new reviewer that was looking into the app, someone who didn't look into like the review history or anything like that. So I was more than happy to copy and paste the previous answer, the previous instructions, so that they could get on with the process. Then after that, there was another clarification that they wanted about something else completely different. And wouldn't you guess it, the next time it was again, how does a user purchase a subscription? Now this is where it starts getting weird. We're stuck in a loop. I will not lie that I thought it was going to be like this forever, that I was stuck in some kind of review hell. So what do? Do I reach out to app review, to the appeal board? Do I reach to technical support? Before I gave up, I actually decided to write something completely different. And to clarify, it was probably between 10 and 15 exchanges of this cycle until finally I decided to write something a bit more harsh. I put exactly those words at the top. Please read. I actually started saying, I've answered this question many times before. I honestly don't know if you're having problems on your end where the history is not visible or something like that. I asked them, please read. Here are the instructions again. Please let us know if there's something we can do to make this process go a bit faster. And with that last reply, where I was a bit more harsh with my reply, the app was finally, magically approved. All it needed was a little bit extra content and not just simply copying and pasting the same instructions over and over again. So that led me to my next lesson. You should not be vague just because they are. I am not going to argue that there are positive aspects to being vague because app review certainly knows it. I am not going to argue whether it's unethical or not in being vague, whether it's us or app review, but I am going to argue that us as developers, we do not have the time or the luxury in being vague. If I had perhaps put in those words, please read earlier in the process, maybe if I had spent an extra 5 minutes writing some extra sentences, just so I didn't hurt the app reviewers' feelings, telling them that they should read, maybe this process wouldn't have gone as long as it did. So yeah, if you value your time and sanity, it's in your best interest as a developer to not be vague in your responses, just because Apple tends to be vague in theirs. Now, I saved the best for last. This is the most recent horror story that I have faced, and it's certainly the most controversial one. And this one is directly tied to the kind of app that it is, simply because it is a very controversial category that the app was in. So brace yourselves. I ask that the audience does not scream until I am done reading what app it is. The app that I am talking about is an NFT app. Horror. If you haven't heard about NFTs, then you're lucky. But NFTs and crypto are very controversial in the space to begin with. Some people tolerate them, and others just hate them with a capital H. And yeah, I knew what I was getting into when I started working on this app. So this NFT app was simple. It was nothing that I would consider questionable or horrendous. It was simply a little gallery app that used the latest Apple technologies for viewing a collection of NFTs, like the widgets, augmented reality, things like that. So I submitted it to test flight, and from then, it's when the fun started. Test flight review came back to me and said, you cannot link to the marketplace. Of course, they were talking about a link to OpenSea. And I was like, okay, I kind of expected this because Apple does not want to move any kind of digital sales outside of their in-app purchases. Okay, so I remove all of the links, make the app entirely self-contained. Now the user has no way for them to actually exit the app through and keep all of their activities within. So I do that. I submit a new build to test flight, and then I get another response from Apple saying, those aren't the exact words that they told me, but yeah. Basically, they were saying that as NFTs were digital goods, they had to go through in-app purchases, even if I never linked outside the app for users to purchase them. I honestly never thought that this was going to be an issue. There were already many NFT apps in the App Store. Some were definitely more, let's just say, controversial than others when it came to their linking practices and what they showed. But yeah, we have that lesson that we must always seek clarification. So I decided to seek clarification why this wasn't acceptable by Apple. I know that the App Store is not fair, but I still needed that clarification. So I must admit that I cheated a little here. For this particular case, I already saw more or less where all this was going. It looked like it was just going to be rejected and rejected until the end of time. So I cheated by reaching out to an Apple contact of mine and asking them what would be acceptable in this case. And between them and talking to App Review, I came to the conclusion that I needed to modify a core functionality of the app to make it more, let's just say, acceptable for them. By the way, did you know that you can appeal test flight rejections? Well, now you know. I didn't know at that time that I could appeal test flight rejections because I never had to appeal a test flight rejection. The appeal came back basically with what I feared. And so I got to work on the plan that I devised based on all the feedback that I got. And finally, the heavily modified app was approved for test flight. I will admit that, like I said, I totally cheated by reaching out to this Apple contact. I maybe would have never gotten this test flight approved if it hadn't been for them. I probably would have given up on the spot and just released it as an open source app or something. But at the end of it, it really felt like a hollow victory to me. I mean, I honestly never expected for Apple to turn around and say that NFTs had to be given the same special treatment as other digital goods. I talk about this because if you've seen other apps in the App Store, they allow you to purchase NFTs or even cryptocurrencies using a credit card, never within app purchases. Even, I think it's technically impossible to do in-app purchases for things that live on the blockchain, simply because of how volatile everything is. So, against my better judgment, I decided that I didn't want to leave this as it currently was. I decided to submit the full app to Apple. I decided that I needed to get this out of the way. I needed to fight back in no simple terms. I prepared all of my counter arguments. I prepared a wall of text for the eventual appeal that I knew that I would have to file. And I did all of this knowing that it would cost me nothing but anxiety. It will severely affect my mental health, my well-being, and that it would most probably end with a rejection. And I was ready to accept all of that because I would have done everything that was possible for the regular developer at this point. So, this is how everything went. When I submitted the app, obviously the first thing that I got asked was, does the app allow the user to access externally purchased NFTs? I expected this, obviously. I told them, yes, it allows them to access externally purchased NFTs, but the app never holds them. The app only uses the public wallet address and uses the OpenSea API to receive everything via that API. It doesn't even allow the user to create their own wallets, connect to wallets, or hold private keys or anything like that. It was a stupid little gallery app. So of course, after I tell them that, they still say, sorry, we're still going to have to reject you. We still require in-app purchases for this. I was prepared for that. I have my appeal ready. So I prepared my wall of text appeal and sent it over to them. I thought it was a very well-written appeal. I always like to brag that I took a lot of technical writing courses in college precisely for times like this, and I certainly put it to the test. But without any surprise, I get rejected by the appeal board. But here's what bothered me more than anything. What I got from the appeal board was the most basic response that I could have gotten. There was no reference to anything that I had written in the appeal. There was just the guideline that I was supposedly breaking. There was no comment about, they didn't even want to comment that they couldn't comment about other NFT apps in the App Store. This was a very generic reply for the appeal. And so I was prepared to lose from the beginning. I already mentioned that. But what I wasn't prepared for was for them to seemingly ignore the appeal that I so carefully crafted. I was very proud of what I wrote, and they didn't even acknowledge it. So I did what I had to do. I had to take it one step further. I actually replied to them. I was perhaps less than kind when I said, with all due respect, did you even read my appeal? Yeah. I was going to war with Apple. I was lucky that they didn't ban me on the spot, I guess. I also asked on the same reply, okay, can you provide guidance on how it would be technically possible to offer in-app purchases for this? In hindsight, that was probably not a smart question, because if they wanted, they could have just said, well, build your own NFT marketplace. And the second question that I asked was, what about the other apps in the App Store that currently deal with NFTs? Again, another probably stupid question, because they never comment about other apps, and the App Store is unfair. But actually, there was some further events that happened after I sent all of this. I actually decided to take it one step further, or two steps to be more accurate, other than replying to the appeal board. The first thing that I did was submit feedback in the developer portal, asking them to reconsider how the in-app purchase rules applied to digital art and currencies, like NFTs. Obviously, you never get a reply from that, but supposedly they receive your feedback to be considered in the future. The second thing that I did, I have to admit, it was very cringy. I actually wrote an email to Tim Cook. I told Tim Cook in that email everything that was happening. I told him why I thought all of this was unfair. I told him that I submitted feedback, that I was talking to App Review, and that was it. Still very cringy now that I look back on it. But something worked, whether it were my words that said, "Did you even read my appeal?" or whether it was the feedback or that email to Tim Cook. Something worked because I got a new message from the appeal board where they said, "We require additional time to review your app and your appeal. There is no further need for a response from your part. At the end of our process, you will receive another reply from us or your app will be approved." To be honest, I was shocked. I was shocked. Like I said from the beginning, I was expected to be rejected. The only reason I took it this step further than I originally planned was because they did not read my wall of text appeal that hurt my ego so badly. And wouldn't you know it, 2 weeks later, I receive an email that says that the app is actually in review. Did this mean that the appeal board decided that it was fine to not offer in-app purchases? And now they were looking for other faults on why to reject the app? Who knows? So I kept an eye on my inbox, and I finally got the email that said that the app was finally approved. From the very start that I first submitted that build to test flight, the one that ended up being rejected immediately, until I finally received that email saying that it had finally been approved for sale in the App Store, 2 whole months had gone by. I'm not gonna lie, this definitely made me want to dance on my desk when I received those news. So much effort went into this. It was the most heated battle I ever had with Apple. And apparently I haven't burned that bridge yet because I still have an active developer account. I was very happy, to say the least. But in retrospective, I learned a final and very important lesson after this entire ordeal. Very easily, luck could not have been on my side. Very easily, I could have been squashed like the bug that I am. So when you're dealing with all of these things that you do for a living or because you simply like doing them, you need to do them because you value the work you do, your time, and your own happiness. If Apple had rejected my app, I was ready to admit that, okay, I enjoyed working on the app. Okay, I don't think it was time that was badly spent. And okay, it definitely made me happy to work on this project. And now these words, fortunately, ring more true now that the app had actually been approved and I put the extra time into dealing with app review beyond the supposedly final rejection. So I'm not here going to say that you should go to war with Apple, especially if it's going to affect your mental health, if you're going to end up wasting unnecessary time. Sometimes it's just better to think about your passions first, about your own happiness first. And this is the biggest lesson that I learned from this entire ordeal. And it actually took me a lot of effort to put into words this particular lesson that I learned. I had another whole speech ready for you, but unfortunately when I timed everything, I couldn't have given the entire speech. So this is the abbreviated version. Now, Let's go quickly through everything. Lessons to survive the App Store horror. First, we talked about seeking clarification. This is super important. This is the thing that I tell everyone. You should always seek clarification because they are vague. There's no other way around it. App review is not fair. You see it time and time again. Just before coming to this conference, I actually looked through Twitter and I saw many horror stories with app review. Many of them actually I thought were unfair, some of them from high-profile developers. But the sooner you make your peace with this, the happier you will be when dealing with app review. Again, you should not be vague just because they are. Those extra 5 minutes that you put in writing something extra for the app review may save you hours, if not days, of frustration. And like I said, value your work, your time, and your own happiness. That's the most important thing of all, especially when you're dealing with a very mentally taxing process like app review currently is. And I do have some additional lessons for all of you. I already admitted that I cheated and I reached out to an Apple rep at some point during the last horror story. This that not everyone has access to these reps, especially if you're starting out in this space. It takes a lot of time and effort to build those kinds of connections, and they don't always have the means to help you. I'm assuming because of some strict Apple policies. Again, I am not an insider, so I don't know how that works. So when you're going to deal with app review, you have to think that you're going to deal with it yourself. Another additional lesson is don't run to the press, but do vent on social media. Now you may be thinking, isn't this the same, venting on social media, as to running to the press? I will argue that it isn't. Basically, when you go and vent on social media, I see many benefits for you that aren't related to crying to the press. If you're like me, your social circle will basically be other developers, probably ones struggling the same way you do. So you will get some reassurance from them. That's very good for your own mental well-being. On the best case scenario, you will actually get tips and other feedback from them about how they dealt with similar circumstances. The last lesson is that compromise is okay. I could have gotten away with just releasing the modified version of the NFT app that I mentioned, but just because I am very stubborn, I decided to go the whole way when everything could have stopped there. It's all based on personal circumstances. And now I am going to say goodbye to you all by saying that you shouldn't believe everything you read on the internet, as the wise Abraham Lincoln once said. Why do I say this? Because I've also seen online many tips about dealing with app review that just don't work, or maybe they worked that one time for that particular person. Maybe I am being watched over the internet right now, so maybe don't believe me either. These are all my own personal experiences, and they may not necessarily apply to your own personal situation with app review, especially if you don't want to anger Apple like I did back then with the last horror story, and like I am probably doing now by exposing all of this to you. And that's everything I have for you today. Hopefully you found this entertaining. Maybe you laughed at my own misery. Maybe you will learn, maybe you will use some of my own lessons in the future. And thank you very much for coming.